Our speaker for this session this afternoon, continuing this series on how we got the Bible, is Dan Owen. And many of our speakers have already been introduced a time or two already today. I won't go over all of this. As you can read in the program, he has an extensive educational background, including a PhD in curriculum instruction and program evaluation from Southern Illinois University. He is a previous resident instructor here at Bear Valley, but is also an adjunct professor here today. And our students consistently say how much they appreciate Dan's classes, his way of teaching. He has a lot of good things to say. We're looking forward to hearing what Dan has to say for us today.
When Jesus gave the Great Commission, he assumed Bible translation. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. That's why almost immediately we found in ancient manuscripts, Coptic manuscripts, the language of Egypt, Latin manuscript, the language of the Romans, Armenian language manuscripts, Gothic manuscripts, the language of the Eastern Europeans, all kinds of different translations, because translation was necessary to convey the gospel to the world. The Pentecost sermon was preached in several different dialects. In fact, in Acts chapter 2, verse 8, it says they heard the apostles speaking in their own dialectos, dialects. The apostles were speaking the languages of the Parthians and the Medes and the dwellers in Mesopotamia and all those other countries that are left there. In fact, in verse 11, it says, we hear them speaking in our own tongues, the manifold works of God. So the apostles were already preaching the gospel on Pentecost in other languages besides their native tongue. All translation involves two steps. It involves original language, like Denny was talking about, either from Greek in the New Testament or Hebrew or Aramaic in the Old Testament. And it involves a receptor language, French, German, Chinese, English, whatever the language might be. The task of translators is how can one reproduce the message of the original language as exactly as possible in the receptor language. Now, we've gone through the stages of how we got the Bible, the claims of inspiration of the Bible, and then Denny talked about how the canon was formed because the people of God universally accepted these writers as prophets of God. He talked about all the evidence we have for the transmission of the text. And so we've established that we have a solid Greek text, a solid Hebrew text, that those texts are inspired of God. But as he closed his lesson, he said, how can we know that those are accurately translated into all the languages in which we have Bibles today? The challenges of translations are many. Different languages put things in different word order. For example, in English, it's our custom to put the subject first, and then the verb, and then the object. But very often in the other languages, you may have the subject at the end of the sentence, or you may have it all turned around, and you have to sift through it and figure that out. You have different idioms. In my class in 1 John, we were talking about 1 John 3, verse 15. Whoever sees his brother having a need, literally in the Greek text, and shuts up his bowels against him, how can the love of God abide in him? Well, what's this business about he shuts up his bowels? That's an idiom. That's a figure of speech. It's got nothing to do with your bowels. What it means is that you have withheld your compassion. You've hardened your heart against somebody. And you can't go into modern languages and translate that shuts up your bowels, or you're not going to get the message of the original across in the modern language. So those that say that they want a literal translation, totally literal, they do not understand what they're talking about. Because if it was totally literal, you would obliterate the message. There's different grammatical structures in different languages. There's different available vocabulary. For example, in Hebrew, if you love a piece of meat, it's achav. If you love your wife, it's achav. If you love the sunset, it's achav. If you love your brother, it's achav. They've just got achav. But in Greek, you've got eros, and you've got agape, and you've got phileo, and you've got storge, and all these different ones that tell you different kinds of love. So you've got different stuff to work with in different languages. And people that don't translate sometimes don't realize this. My task today is to tell you about one tiny fragment of the story of translation. The people in Egypt would start with the Coptic, and they would tell you all about the history of the Egyptian translation. The people in Ethiopia would start with the Ethiopic in ancient times and tell you about the history of theirs. There was a Spanish Bible translated in the 1500s. The Reina Valera of today, how did that get here? We could tell all about that. But we're just going to talk about one little island, the British Isles, and this mutt language of ours, English, that has come down to us. English is a West Germanic language that originated from the Anglo-Frisian dialects. I'm sure you know what that means. That means that people from Denmark and Norway and Saxony or Germany and Frisia, which is part of Germany, and Francia, which was France, and all of these different countries, all that mixed together like a mutt dog that's a little bit of everything. You know, he's part poodle and part Labrador and part 300 other things. That's what English is. English is an amalgam type language. The Germanic in Old English is very, very prevalent. If you go to the map there, the Jutes, the Danes, the Angles from over in the area of Norway or Denmark, they all raided England, and they raped and pillaged, and their language affected the Saxons, the Frisians, and all the rest of these. They went a Viking. A Viking just means raiding. They all were under that umbrella of raiders, and some of them camped in the British Isles, and their languages affected the language of Britain. The earliest samples of the language that we have, you have this picture of Stonehenge, and this is some of the Old English that we have from like the 600s, the 700s. There's no way on earth you would recognize it if you tried. The next one is of what they think Stonehenge used to look like when it was a religious site for the Druids. Flip through those next 3 or 4, you've got some of the types of people that came into the British Isles. Then you get to the Celtic ruins that we have of some of the monasteries, the Celtic crosses. These monasteries, some of them go back to the 600s AD, and here we begin to just find the beginnings of the history of Old English. This is another sample of Old English. You could study it all afternoon, and you wouldn't be able to figure out anything about what that actually says. This is another of those monasteries. Now, when we come to Anglo-Saxon England, there were some old churchmen of that time in the 600s and 700s, and mostly they used Latin manuscripts of the Bible. This Latin manuscript is of the beginning of the Gospel of John. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word. See, that's Latin, and most of them had Latin manuscripts, and they would read those manuscripts in church, and the English farmers would sit there, and they wouldn't have any idea what anybody was saying, see? And, the priest would do the Lord's Supper, and he would go, Hoc est corpus meum, which is good Latin, which just means, this is my body. Why didn't he just say that? Well, because it was in Latin, and it was like magic words that was supposed to transform the bread into something else. Well, in the English Bible, Caedmon was a monk from a monastery at Whitby in York, and he was one of the first to put Bible stories into English poetry. He was a cowherd, and you've got the old Celtic cross next to his picture there, and some of his writings are there in that screen. Go to the next one if you would, and this is a very interesting one because it's about Moses and Pharaoh and the children of Israel and what they did. And that first phrase there, Nebioth ge de fortran the Pharaoh broten. Well, see, that sounds very Germanic, but if you flip the slide there, you'll see that the first line means, be not frightened thereat, though Pharaoh has brought. So you can see Pharaoh and brota, and you can say fortran, frightened, and Nebioth, be not. But if you weren't really being told this, it'd be hard. Sphered Vigendra, Irla Unram, means sword wielders, vast troops. Okay? The next one, Im Elam vil mightig dreiten thur mein hand to dega thisem deadlin gifen. To them all will the mighty Lord through my hand this very day recompense give. Notice in the last line, today, that's today. And gifen, G-Y-F-A-N, give. Now, these are ancient forms of English words that were just in their early development in a language that was very different than our own. Also on the map of Anglo-Saxon England, I don't know if you can see it very well, but up there in the north there is a monastery called Yarrow off of the east coast. And that monastery at Yarrow, these are some ruins of that monastery at Yarrow, the next one if you go there. That's where a guy, a little short guy, very short, probably like this, his name was Bede, B-E-D-E. And Bede wrote a book called The History of the English Church and People, apart from which we would know absolutely nothing about the ancient history of English people. And he was reported to have translated the Gospel of John and some other things. He lived between 673 and 735. And the next slide, this slide shows you an actual manuscript of Bede's history of the English church and people and what was going on there. He had a tiny little casket, and his tiny little casket is in a church over there in England now. And Cindy and I were in England one time, and we went into a house that was built way back in like the 12th century or something, and the doorway was like this high. And we had to duck under there and get in there because people were really short back then. And the diet and everything else, and they grew up later on. The first things we confront in English, actually as Bibles, were Latin manuscripts that had English written between the lines. And this is old, like 7th century English. One of the first was a manuscript of the Psalms. Then we have the Lindisfarne Gospels, which I'll show you some pictures of in a minute. And then we have, this actually is, go to that one there. Yeah, that's the manuscript of the Psalms, one of the first ones we have. And the big, go back there, yeah, thank you. The big ones are in Latin, and the little bitty ones between the lines, that's the English written between the lines. The next picture there is of the monastery at Lindisfarne. And they are famous for the production of the Lindisfarne Gospels. And the next two that you have, this is of the Gospel of Matthew. And if you'll go back to that last one, please. On the outside corner out there, outside the picture, you see the little bitty chicken scratching. That's English that's written there. And the next one, if you go to that one, this is of the Gospel of Luke, and it's a real close-up. And you can see the Old English written between the lines. Now, there were very few of these. These were not available to very many people, but it was just the beginnings of the idea of putting the Bible into the language of the English people. This next one, the Wessex Gospels, is one of my favorites. This is a parable that we know, and so we can relate well to it. Sothlisa ut eod se sower his seed to sow. So then the sower went out to sow his seed. Notice the second line. And thatha he sow. Notice that T-H-A means that which. All right. Thatha he sow. Summa he fell in with veg. Means some fell by the way, by the wayside, with veg. Third line, second word. And fuglas komen and ate the fowls. Fuglas, fowls came and ate it. Notice that T-H-A there at the end of that sentence is the same that was used at the beginning of the second sentence. And T-H-A means something different each time it's used. And the only way you can figure it out is the context. Languages are fascinating to me. After that sentence, Sothlisa sum fell on steinite. Some fell on the stony ground. There het neef de meeklen earthen. It didn't have sufficient earth. And redlisa upsprungen. It hurriedly sprung up. For them the hay neeften their earthen deepen. It didn't have enough deep earth. Sothlisa upsprungen rasunnen. That's where the sun came up and burned down hot on it. And agruden and forskrunken them. It shrunk them all up. See? And he neeften weirtum. And then it says, Sothlisa summa felen on thornus. That's the ones that fell on the thorns. And thatha thornus wexen. Remember the King James says waxed? The thornus waxen. That means the thorns really hurried up and grew. And they grew tough and thick and everything like that. And fourth mistum tha. Summa Sothlisa felen on good earth. And it fell on the good ground. And sealed and wastem sum hondefieldna, sum sixtigefieldna, Sum Thera. Now you can hear the heavy Germanic in that, can't you? Because the Saxon language and the Norse, Danish languages really have a lot to do with the development of the English language. Well, this was the 10th century when the Wessex Gospels were done. And this is the beginning of the Gospel of Mark in the Wessex Gospels. And you see when written in the Old English hand, it's almost impossible to realize what's said. The Norman conquest came in 1066. Normandy, see Norman, that just means French, the Franks. And they came and they intermixed with the English people, and the language totally evolved and totally changed and went through another stage. Then we have the 11th century Hexateuch, Genesis through Joshua. This is an example of some 11th century English. Well, if it was good enough for Mom and Grandma, it should be good. No, you got to be joking me. Your grandma couldn't make that out, and you couldn't either. See, 11th century English will not work for us today. I love this Chaucer. This is one of my favorite ones to share with the students. This is about 11th century or so. And Juan I saw he would never find to redden on this cursed book at night. This guy was reading a book and the other guy wanted to go to sleep. I suddenly 3 leaves have I plight out of his book. He tore some pages out of his book. And as he read it, and eke I with my fist, this is what I wanted to do to Denny Petrillo when he told me to come down. But eke I with my fist, so took him on the cheek, that in our fear he fifth backward a down. That means he knocked him down on his back. And up he sturt as doth a woodleyan, and with his fist he smote me on the heed, and that in the floor I lay as I were deed. And one he swag how still that I lay, he was aghast and would have fled his way, till at last out of my swa I brayed, Oh, hast thou slain me, false thief? I said, and for my land thou hast mordred me. Ere I did, yet will I kiss thee. That's just how I feel about you, Denny. All right, so you get the idea here, even though this is a lot of fun, that it would be impossible for our teenagers or people off the street to read this kind of a thing if it was in the Bible. Well, after the 11th century, the Crusades took place, and back from the east came much knowledge, and the rise of universities in Europe took place. And John Wycliffe in the 1300s, he was a Catholic priest at Oxford University, and he translated the Bible. His students were called Lollards. Go on to that next one if you would, Steve, and keep on going through that, because we'll never get through. There's some of his students that went out preaching in the churches, which was a totally new idea. Now, look at this text. This is a manuscript Bible. There were no printed English Bibles until the middle of the 15th century. And you'll notice there's still no chapters and verses in this Bible. There were no chapters and verses until the 1500s. But this says, if you start with the blue T, take ye heed, yet ye do not your righteousness, third line, before men to be saying of him. Else, meaning otherwise, ye shouldn't have no meed at your father. See? Well, now, good luck on that. If you want to read that for your whole Bible, go to the next one if you would. He says, for even as ye shouldn't pray, next line after the little slide, not the next slide, second line, Our Father, third line, yet art in heavens, hallowed be ye name, middle of the fourth line, ye kingdom come to be, ye will done in air as in heaven. Give to us this day our bread. See, that's the Lord's Prayer, but it's in 14th century English, which would be almost impossible for us to understand. One more, go to the Gospel of John there, in the 1st of John. In ye beginning was ye Word, and ye Word was at God. Notice that God is not capitalized. That's because it's not different in the Greek. And God was ye Word. Yis was in ye beginning at God. All yegus were in mad be Him. That means all things were made by Him. But this is John Wycliffe's Bible, which was quite effective during the time that he was writing. The next one is part of the introduction in his Bible to 2 Corinthians. We won't read through that. But after Wycliffe died, before they could kill him, the Constitutions of Oxford, under Bishop Arundel in 1408, said that no one henceforth on his own authority might translate any text of Holy Scripture into the English or any other language until the translation itself should have been approved by the diocesan, meaning the bishop of the place. And the chances of that happening were zero. It wasn't going to happen, see? But then the Gutenberg brothers invented the printing press in the middle of the 1400s, several years after Wycliffe's death. And the first Bible they produced was, again, the Latin Vulgate, not in the language of the people. Erasmus, a scholar that worked in the Greek and Latin text, he produced a Greek New Testament very soon. And then, not very long after that, the Reina Valera version, the Spanish version, which they call the Biblia del Oso, the Bible of the Bear, because of this little picture of the bear on there, was produced. And of course, we all know about Martin Luther in 1517, a Catholic priest who challenged 95 points of Roman Catholic doctrine at Wittenberg University. Luther and his cohort, Philip Melanchthon, produced the German Bible in the early 1500s. And here you have a slice of that German Bible that was produced in the 1500s. And by this time, we're getting chapter and verse notations there. The next one shows that this was happening all over the empire. There were people in Swiss and German and English worlds and others in the French world that were translating the Bible during the Restoration movement. The next one is a frontispiece of a Luther Bible. And the next one is a picture of the book of Proverbs in the German Luther Bible. And so these are all part of what was going on during the Reformation movement. Preaching became something that was very prominent in the church. It used to be all about the Lord's Supper, and now it was all about preaching the Word. And the Lord's Supper was no longer the center as it had been in Catholicism. The preaching of the Word was central as it is in Protestant churches today. William Tyndale was born in 1494, lived till 1536, and he was extremely influential, probably in our biblical tradition, the most influential of anybody we've talked about. He wrote, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spare my life ere many years, I will cause that a boy that driveth the plow shall know more of the Scripture than thou dost." He was talking to a church official when he said that. He believed that the people ought to be able to read the Bible and understand it for themselves in their own language. Tyndale published the New Testament in 1525, and he was executed after fleeing to the continent and being captured. He was executed in 1536, and he had translated quite a few parts of the Bible. You see on that next slide a picture of Tyndale from back in that time, and it says, "The New Testament gently corrected and compared with the Greek by William Tyndale." See, and then it gives you the year of publication. Go to the next one. This is the book of Acts in William Tyndale, and I could sit here and look at these things all day, and I do look at them very closely sometimes and read the text of the book of Acts there, but it's still quite different from ours. The next one is of the Gospel of Matthew in Tyndale's Bible. I want you to look at the top of the slide there. This is where Peter says, "I know not the man." And immediately the cock crew. Then thought Peter upon the wordus of Jesus, which said unto him, "Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice," and went out and wept bitterly. Now, the King James is largely the work of William Tyndale. Most of William Tyndale's work is carried on in the King James Version and is passed down through that tradition. We saw the Gospel of John in the Wycliffe Bible. So in the Tyndale Bible, go back to there you go right there. This is the first chapter of John. In the beginning was that Word. Add, that Word was with God. Notice, again, no capitalization. And God was that Word. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without it, wait a minute, isn't that supposed to say without Him? He said without it was made nothing that was made. It's very interesting to see how they did this. Next one of Peter, and it's talking about, it's the book of 1 Peter, if you read it. It's very interesting how they put it. The next one shows what happened to Tyndale for his efforts. He got strangled to death and then set on fire and burned at the stake. Miles Coverdale took Tyndale's work and published it. And you see in this frontispiece of a Coverdale Bible some of the philosophy of these reforming translators. On the left-hand top corner, you've got God reaching through the clouds to Moses and saying, "These are the laws that thou shalt lay before them." And then underneath Moses there you've got Ezra, and he's reading the law out loud to the people of God, so that they can understand it, giving the sense. Then at the top right you've got Jesus saying, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel," like it's supposed to be given directly to the people. And then you've got the apostles at the bottom with the tongues of fire, preaching in the languages of the people on Pentecost. Again, showing that the Bible ought to be in the languages of the people. The Great Bible was published and overseen by Coverdale in 1539, carrying this same translation tradition down into a big Bible that was chained in the churches, and you had to have permission to read it. One of the most influential translations before the King James, and I have a facsimile in my office, is the Geneva Bible. And it was published in the 1550s, and it was widely read, probably more popular for a while than was the King James. And the next one there is a slide out of Revelation, I think 18, from the Geneva Bible. Then we had the Bishop's Bible, which was a short-lived and not very popular version. If you'll go to the next one, notice here, this is on Genesis chapter 3. "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Yea, hath God indeed said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" You get the idea. It's very similar to the King James. Then King James VI of Scotland became James I of England. And from 1603 to 1611, he had a bunch of translators working on the King James Version. And this gives you some facts, which we don't have time to go into. But I've got 2 or 3 slides here of the 1611 King James. Now, if you actually read the facsimile copies of the 1611 King James like this one, let's just take a minute with that last one. "He took it and ate before them, and he said to them, These are the words which I spake to you while I was yet with you. All things must be fulfilled." That's Luke 24, verse 44. See? And this is out of the King James Bible. You have the epistle of Paul to the Hebrews. By the way, in the ancient manuscripts, it doesn't say that. It just says pros Hebraios to the Hebrews. But now they're publishing, this is Paul's epistle to the Hebrews. It's very interesting. And let's go to the next one there. This is from the publishers of the King James Bible, the translators. They said, "It is necessary to have translations, plural, in readiness." Don't just pick one translation. I get frustrated with my students sometimes in the school because I ask them, "What translation are you reading?" And all these hands popped up, and they're all reading the ESV or they're all reading the NASB. I wish they were reading 3 or 4 different translations so we could compare them, But don't just have one translation. Have 2 or 3 good translations that you can study and compare. But it says, "Translation is that which openeth the window to let in the light. Indeed, without translation into the vulgar tongue." Now, vulgar doesn't mean naughty words. Vulgar means the common language of the common people that are talking out in the street. And that's what the King James was. We think, Wist ye not, and thou saidest, and thou wistest is holy, highfalutin language. No. When the guy got his dog in from the street, he said, wist ye not that it is time for your supper, dog? You know, that was the way people talked in the street. They said thee and thou to their kid, their dog, their friend, to their cat, everything. That's the only way they talked. It wasn't highfalutin language. It was a modern speech language, a modern English translation in the year 1611 in contemporary English. I'm not allowed to say this, but it was the NIV in 1611. That's what it really was, okay? And if you read the philosophy of the people that actually did the translation, they make that quite clear. Go to the next one if you would. What can be more available thereto, that is for people to understand in their own tongue, than deliver God's book into God's people in a tongue which they understand? Now, the bottom line of this lesson, and we've still got some time to explain a few things in detail, is this. Translation is an ongoing process. There is no perfect translation. There are more literal translations and more paraphrastic translations. There are some translations, like they're not really translations, like The Message, Eugene Peterson's paraphrase. It's not trying in any way to be a translation. It's like a very free commentary. That's not a Bible. Don't use it as a Bible. The old Kenneth Taylor's The Living Bible is a paraphrase of the old American Standard Version in English into, it's just his commentary on the Bible. Those don't purport to be Bibles if you'll read what it says in the preface of those Bibles. But we need to read a variety of translations. And when you translate, there's not just one way to do it. And literalness is a theory, but it's not a fact. For example, and I'm going to get into this in just a minute. You can leave that up there. Go ahead, that's fine. But the other day I was talking to my little granddaughter about her Spanish. We were studying Spanish together. And her assignment was to answer the time. What time is it? And in Spanish you say, ¿Qué hora es? Literally that means, what hour is it? What they mean is, what time is it? But ¿Qué hora es means, what hour is it? And if you reply, you say, son las 3:30. That means they are 3:30. So if you want to be very literal, what hour is it? They are 3:30. Well, you don't talk like that. And if you translated that literally from Spanish into English, it wouldn't really flow very well. What they're really trying to say is, what time is it? And it's 3:30, you know. But that's not the way they say it. So every language is different. This is a passage, this is 1 Corinthians 2:13, one of the great passages about the inspiration of the Bible. And this is the Greek text and the English in between. Things also we speak. That's literally the first three words. Not in taught, human wisdom words. See, this is literal. So things also we speak, not in taught human wisdom words, but in taught of spirit, two spiritual things bringing together. Now, how would you like to have that read that way? You cannot translate. That's literal. You think you do, but you don't want a literal translation. That's an idea in people's heads that's wrong-headed. What you want is somebody to take that language and bring it across in its forms to our language in the way that we say it, which is the things that we speak. This is the King James. We speak not in words which man's wisdom teaches, but which the Holy Ghost teaches, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. Now, I love the King James here because instead of trying to put an object with the last part, they just left it like it was, comparing spiritual things to spiritual. Look at the next one we've got on there. This is the NIV. This is what we speak. Not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths in spiritual words. Go to the next one. This is the ASV. Which things also we speak, not in words which man's wisdom teacheth, but which the Spirit teaches, combining spiritual things with spiritual, thank you ASV, words. Showing you that it's not in the original, but that's what they think it refers to. Go to the next one. This is the BBE, the Bible in Basic English. These are the things which we say, not in the language of man's wisdom, but in words given to us by the Spirit, judging the things of the Spirit by the help of the Spirit. Well, they've added a few words into it. They're trying to explain it to people that can't read English as a first language. Go to the next one if you would. This is the New American Standard. Which things also we speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in those taught by the Spirit, combining spiritual thoughts with spiritual words. The words in red are not in the original text. Do you realize that there's not a hair's difference, between the King James and the NIV and the ESV and the ASV and the NASB? There's not a hair's difference between any of them, and they're all communicating the exact same truth there. All of them are. Go to the next one if we have another. This is the New Century Version. We speak about these things not with words taught us by human wisdom, but with words taught us by the Spirit. So we explain spiritual truths to spiritual people. Shoot me, but they got the last part of this correct. And if we had a time to open the Greek text of Corinthians, I'd show you why. The reference is to people. The next verse says, "For the natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God." And the next verse says, "But he that is spiritual." And then if you go down to 3:1, he says, "I could not speak to you as unto spiritual." Spiritual what? People. See? But the context determines what that's really all about. All right. Next one there. We won't bother with that one. Let's get to another text real quick. Keep it going. Keep it going. All right. Here's another one that we're all into, because this is about elders and the qualifications of elders. Pistos ho logos, faithful is the saying or the word. If anyone, oregatai, desires episkopes. You see that word episkopes? That's one word. One word. The King James translates that the office of a bishop. If anyone desires overseeing, if anyone desires caretaking, that would be more like what the verse actually says. A good work he desires. What does he desire? A work. He doesn't desire a position. He doesn't desire an office. He desires a work. What is that work? It's taking care of souls. That's what the work is. Episkopes means looking over. That's what a shepherd did with his sheep. He was always looking them over to see if they were okay. So that's the text in Greek, and that's a literal translation, pretty much. Let's look at some of the choices. KJV, this is a true saying. If a man desires, all that in red is the translation of one word. The office of a bishop. The Bible never heard of a bishop. The Bible in the original language never heard of one of those high church officials. Never knew anything about it. Not a bishop. He's a caretaker. He's an overseer. Okay? He desireth a good work. Go to the next one. Faithful is the saying, if a man seeketh the office of a bishop. Why? We've got too much high church translation there. If you read the translators in the King James, they tried to preserve the offices of the Church of England in their translation. ASV was too chicken to change it. The office, that's just what it is. They were too chicken to make it right when they changed it. The BBE says they're too chicken too, even for those that can't read English. Go to the next one. The Douay Rheims, they kept it. The Roman Catholic Vision, the office of a bishop. The TLB, Taylor's Living Bible, bless his heart, Kenneth Taylor got it closer than all those before him. To be a pastor, to be a shepherd, to be looking over the sheep. Kenneth Taylor, even though he couldn't read the original language, he got closer to the meaning of that verse. Oh, I'm going to be in bad trouble after this. Okay, go ahead to the next one. The NASB, the office of an overseer. Why do we need the office of? If any man desires episkopes, overseeing. All right, go to the next one. NCV, the New Century Version. What I say is true. Anyone wanting to become an elder. Well, unfortunately, the word elder isn't in there, and that doesn't get into overseeing. So that one's not that great. Go to the next one. The RSV reverts back to the old office of a bishop. Next one. Okay, well, I didn't think I put the NIV. Anybody got an NIV out there? Well, I've forgotten what the NIV says, but I think it's a little bit closer maybe to what we're supposed to be talking about. Pros and cons of the King James. It's a good, fairly literal translation of the Greek text that they had available to them that day. It's very readable and smoothly phrased in 17th century English. Weaknesses, nobody understands 17th century English today. All right, and it's based on the Textus Receptus. Next one. The New King James, really good English translation based on a 5% less accurate Greek text. Next one. The ASV, really good literal translation, except it's so King Jamesy, it's hard to read. You couldn't take a teenager or somebody on the street and say, here's your ASV, learn the Bible. They wouldn't have any idea what they were reading. Let's go to the next one, the New American Standard. A very good translation, tries to show the significance of the verb tenses. Not very readable because it's so literal for most people. It's a good Bible for a serious student of the Bible. Next one. The NIV, it's a modified literal to dynamic equivalence translation. It's very readable. It's the most popular version in the country. I'm not talking about the brand new NIV that's erased the genders and all that. I'm talking about the 1984 NIV, and sometimes it's not quite as consistent in translating the same Greek word the same way. Next one. The ESV, I really like this. It's not as readable as the NIV and some others, but it's a good literal translation for serious students of the Bible. What's the bottom lines of all this? To wrap it up. See, I'm a bad boy, like Denny's been a bad boy. But the bottom line is this. Don't marry yourself to one translation. Get 3 or 4 of them and compare them in your study. And learn from 3 or 4 different ones and see the nuances of the passages. And don't argue with people and have big fights over translations. What we need to do is open the Bible that we have and read it and do what it says. Okay? And we can all go to heaven together. Thank you very much, and God bless you.